our therapeutic counselors in the district working with Arroyo Seco students. So we're lucky to have you here as well. And so thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's nice to see you all.
And of course, I can't let the meeting go on further without recognizing the great team we have here. I won't ask everyone to introduce themselves, but our two fantastic assistant principals, Ms. Dos Remedios and Ms. Baku. We have three fabulous counselors, Ms. Delantais, Ms. Ward, Mr. Marshall. Ms. Hahn is working with them as well this year. And so they do a great job. They're always here. If we do have questions or you have concerns, feel free to reach out to any one of us. Mrs. Baku will be posting a link to a Google form in the chat throughout the session. So if you do feel that you need to reach out to someone or reach out for help, we will have a way of doing that throughout the session tonight. And then at the end, she will also share a little bit more specific information about all of the varied supports that we have available here at Arroyo Seco. And I do want to let you know that we are planning to record the session with the intent of sharing it on our counseling website. So for people who are unable to be here for Dr. Schonfeld's presentation, we do want to make that available. And I've had the privilege of hearing Dr. Schonfeld on a couple occasions. I think we're very fortunate to have him come and speak with us this evening. He is the director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. And as you can see from the shared screen, his presentation tonight will be on how we can talk to and support our children during the current pandemic. So with that, welcome, Dr. Schonfeld. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how do you talk to and support children during this pandemic. And a lot of this is going to be relevant to adults as well. But I'll also be talking about preparing for the one-year mark of the tragedy that occurred at Saugus High School. So I'm going to try and cover both of those, and I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. So what I wanted to start with is just some discussion about some of the common reactions that you may see as a result of either the pandemic or a shooting. It's actually just common reactions to a crisis event in general. And I'm just going to go over this quickly. I do want to say the most common reaction is actually not on the slide, and that's nothing. So most children and most adults who are distressed after a crisis event actually don't mention it. They tend to try and hide that for various reasons that we can go over. So we want to make sure that we're reaching out to kids whenever they've had difficult experiences, even if they don't seem to show us any distress. But these are some of the things that you might see. So the first one is on fears. And so you can obviously have fears that are related to the pandemic, such as a fear of becoming ill or becoming infected. But you may also see just anxiety, and that will include fears that are not specifically related to the crisis itself. So for example, you can have a shooting during daylight, or you can have a pandemic and still become more afraid of the dark, because that's a developmental fear that kids have. We also do see school avoidance after crisis events of pretty much any nature. That can obviously be after a school shooting, but it also occurs even after natural disasters that happen outside of school hours. It seems that kids are afraid or reluctant to separate from caregivers if there's been a crisis event out of some fear that their parents won't be there to protect them, or because they want to be present to try and help and support their family members. Now, after sheltering at home for an extended period during this pandemic, when children are expected to return to school physically, we should anticipate that many of them are going to be afraid to return to public spaces such as schools while the virus is still circulating. And many parents are also going to be reluctant to send their children. So school avoidance is a common reaction that you'll see. You can also see sleep problems, and that could be trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, difficulty waking in the morning, or nightmares or any disruption in sleep. And if there are disruptions in sleep, then the kids don't do well academically, and the parents don't do well in their work performance because generally they're not sleeping well. I actually just had clinic this afternoon, and I was talking with one of the parents, and his child has some anxiety, and there have been nights where the child's only slept about an hour. So both parents are co-sleeping with children of the same gender in their family. So, and, I'm talking about the fact we really got to get you some sleep because, they work and they also have kids who have responsibilities. Now, these adjustment reactions, such as sleep problems, but it can also be a change in appetite or eating, which you might see weight gain or weight loss. Those adjustment reactions are not specific to the pandemic, and it may actually be difficult sometimes to determine what the actual cause is. So just as an example, you'll find that difficulty sleeping is really one of the most common reactions to any type of crisis event. But that can actually come from a range of reasons. And I know parents ask me, well, how do I know if my adolescent isn't sleeping because my adolescent is anxious, because they have post-traumatic stress reactions, because they're depressed, because they're bored, or because they're an adolescent and they like staying up late at night. And there's a certain amount of staying up late at night that you see among adolescents when they're given the opportunity. They will switch the phase. They'll kind of switch when they go to sleep to later. And I expect that to be happening even more during the pandemic. It's kind of a way, can even be an adaptive way for children who are stuck at home with their parents for like 6 months on end to try and get some social distancing when they can't actually physically distance from their parents because they're in the same house.
Why no?
So it's a way for them to kind of get some time alone. So they wait for their parents to go to sleep and other adults in the family, and then they can stay up and they can finally get the television without somebody watching along with them. They can text or email their friends, or they can just be alone. And so in some ways that isn't maladaptive, but the problem is if they have to be up the next morning for online classes, or they're supposed to be doing some homework, or they have other responsibilities, that can cause disruptions and problems. Or if their activities at night are keeping up their parents who are trying to sleep, or the other way around, that their parents are making noise in the morning when they're trying to sleep in, all of that can cause tension within the household. And so really what I try and emphasize is you don't want to say to your kid, you shouldn't stay up so late. You don't want to try and assign a value to what's happening because it's not a bad thing if it's not causing problems. What you do want to do is point out if it's maladaptive. I'm not being critical of the fact that you stay up late, but then you're not waking up at time for your classes, and that's causing problems. So you focus on when the behavior is maladaptive or causing conflict or impacting someone else negatively, and then you need to work on it. So, people say, well, how do I know? Is it depression? Is it anxiety? Well, you may not. But if it's causing a problem, then you start working on sleep. And if that isn't improving, then you may need to look for the cause because you may need more targeted intervention. And of course, if you think your child is seriously depressed and may be at risk of harming themselves, or they're abusing drugs and you think that's why this is happening, then you do need to delve more deeply. But if it's causing some problems and you don't think there's an underlying mental health issue or safety concern, then sometimes you just work on trying to improve the behavior without spending as much time on trying to argue about whether it's abnormal or they shouldn't be doing it. Getting back to the list, you can have difficulty with concentration, and that causes academic problems, but also causes work performance problems in adults. You can see sadness and depression, and a certain amount of sadness is very understandable. I mean, these are difficult times and there's a lot negative happening. And so, I was talking with one school in New York City. Their principal had died at a young age, very suddenly, not related to COVID, but they had other deaths in the school community from COVID. This was early on in the pandemic, so they were starting to they knew that they only had about 4 weeks before graduation. They had financial concerns because of budgetary issues in the city. And they had just been and they were informed about that time they were going to lose funding for about half of their counseling staff. And they were also trying to figure out if they were even going to be open for school after those 4 weeks. And I remember talking with the leadership of the school, and they said, well, teacher morale is poor. And my comment was, of course it's poor. Like, you can be a great leader, but you can't make that situation a happy situation. And so there's a certain amount with, yeah, we're in the midst of a pandemic. There are people who have been negatively impacted in so many ways, not just around infection or illness from the virus. And as a result, if your child voices that they're sad at times, that's understandable. If it is severe, if it's persistent, if they're, talking about harming themselves, then we have to start thinking about depression, and you need to get more, you need to explore that further, and we'll go over how to do that. But a certain amount of sadness is understandable in a sad situation. Individuals who are also distressed from crisis events may actually show anger or irritability. They become less tolerant of change, less tolerant of unpredictability, and less tolerant of additional stress. Unfortunately, we have more of all three. So that just makes it difficult. And then individuals who are in crisis situations can often show distrust and suspiciousness. And those type of reactions can challenge pre-existing relationships among friends and colleagues and family members. And it makes it hard for kids to form new trusting relationships. So I was concerned about how we were going to provide support for kids in the spring when we moved to remote lessons, but I'm even more concerned now in the fall, because a lot of these students don't have relationships, trusting relationships with their new educators, and they may not have the same type of supportive network even among their peers if they're in new classes. So we really have to make sure that we're spending some significant time on building those relationships. We can't just assume it's going to happen naturally. Another reaction that you may see is alcohol and other substance use. That could be tobacco, for example, or even other drug use. And that has to be part of what we consider when we see changes in behaviors or functioning among kids. It also can happen in adults as well. So I actually make a point of saying that we should not be using alcohol whenever we're having social functions that involve adults that are school events, for example. I went over this with a group of superintendents, and one of the superintendents just said, "Oh, I think I made a mistake. I shipped wine to all of my staff when we first had to shelter in place." And I was like, yeah, I really would not be sending alcohol to people right now, because it encourages some people to self-medicate. And quite honestly, that can be a problem. Now, I had, in October, I had 2 major conferences for professional reasons from 2 major societies I'm in. Both of them had virtual happy hour where people were supposed to be drinking alcohol. And one of them even had a session on how to mix drinks. And I just thought I would not recommend that. So I do think we just have to be conscious that we're not recommending or using alcohol as a way to kind of help cope with some of the distress, because some people are vulnerable and that can cause problems. Grief is also another reaction, and that grief could be related to bereavement, but there's also grief from other forms of loss. So it may be that, they're grieving the loss of a sense of safety or of their typical routines or the ability to celebrate holidays with extended family members. And I can discuss that during the discussion period, but grief is really a whole nother topic. And I wanted to make sure I left plenty of time for discussion. I skipped over physical symptoms. You can see headaches and stomach aches and fatigue and a range of kind of physical complaints. And that can be due to a number of reasons. One can be just psychological distress. Psychological distress can present as physical symptoms. And we call that somatization when that occurs. But a lot of times people go to see healthcare providers complaining of physical complaints, but actually they're psychologically distressed. But it's complicated in a pandemic. That may actually be, you can have physical symptoms such as pains and fatigue because of the impact of stress hormones. So stress hormones themselves can worsen asthma and bring on asthma attacks. It can worsen high blood pressure, worsen diabetes. So there's a physiological effect from stress hormones that can actually bring on physical illness. So if you're a school nurse or you're a nurse in the clinic or a doctor in the clinic and an adolescent comes in short of breath, you have to sort out, are they having panic attack because they're psychologically distressed? Are they having an asthma attack because of stress hormones? Or are they infected due to COVID and having respiratory symptoms from that? So please, this is a good time to be nice to your school nurse because it's very complicated. And often it's a combination of a number of these factors. You can also see guilt. I want to spend a little time on that. It turns out that people somehow manage to find reasons to feel guilty, irrespective of their actual experience or role in a crisis event. At some level, mainly unconsciously, it may actually be easier to feel responsible for something you did, didn't do, or should have done to prevent someone you care about from getting infected, ill, or having a serious outcome from the illness, rather than to accept the harsher reality, which is it had nothing to do with you. Because if you accept the fact it had nothing to do with you, that means it could happen to someone else you care about, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. So sometimes people, as I said, unconsciously may actually accept guilt because it helps relieve their feeling of being overwhelmed, and it gives them an illusion of control. And that provides some initial reassurance. But the problem is it is an illusion of control. So it doesn't actually help prevent other people from having the same bad outcome. And it leaves the person with guilt that makes it very difficult to adjust. So children who experience the death of a family member during the pandemic may question how they might have inadvertently exposed a family member to the virus, how they should have picked up on symptoms before the illness became serious, or wondered if there was something they could have done to get help for that person earlier on in the course of the illness. You'll also see guilt such as this after a school shooting, for example, because people for the same reason will wonder what they did, didn't do, could have done, or should have done. I remember going to respond to a shooting. It actually was a stabbing, a very brutal stabbing that killed several people in one family that was committed by a teenager who was a recent graduate from the high school. He actually was trying to get some money for drugs that he was addicted to from family members, and they did not give him the money. So he killed all of the family in the home except one child who was at a sleepover. And so it was a very traumatic loss at the time. And it happened over the holiday period. And it was in a community that had not had a murder for over 25 years. So I went to meet with people, and that included meeting with the elementary school. And when I talked about guilt, several of the teachers in the elementary school came up and told me that they felt responsible, that they had taught this young man when he was about 6 or 7 years of age, depending on what grade they were in. And they said they knew something was wrong and they didn't feel they had done enough, and it was their fault that these murders had occurred. I mean, the guilt is just very prevalent. And we even see guilt for people who are feeling badly that they didn't experience loss or trauma, that they somehow were not as affected as others. So we get survivor guilt, we get guilt for people who are feeling like they weren't negatively impacted in the same way. So guilt is just a common type of reaction. Now, again, all these reactions may be due to the pandemic itself, but they may also be due to a wide range of other stressors that are associated with the pandemic or even unassociated. So the financial impact of unemployment or partial employment and other stressors associated with the pandemic can increase tensions among the adults in the household. That can lead to more parental anxiety, depression, or worsen mental illness among parents and other adults, or contribute to even domestic violence or child abuse. So during the pandemic, I really suggest school professionals not just look for children who have had a family member become ill or die, but actually just ask children more broadly how they're doing in the midst of everything that's going on. Now, during this time, I always advise people we should watch our media consumption and make sure it's a healthy diet and that we don't consume too much of it. Adults should try to keep informed through focused and periodic attention to a trusted media outlet or other trusted source of information, but you shouldn't listen to, watch, or read continual coverage, even though it's available. And so is there continuous coverage about the election and everything associated with the election that people find negative. This pandemic and perhaps this election is going to be here for quite some time, and we're just going to become overwhelmed and exhausted if we try and keep up with all the information, if you're not already at that point. It's kind of useful to remind yourself there really are two main reasons to listen to, watch, or read media coverage during a crisis. One is to be reassured, and the other is to learn new practical steps to keep yourself or those you care about safe. So if you're watching the news or looking at social media or listening to the radio, and you aren't getting more reassured, which quite honestly, I don't know how you could be getting reassured based on much of what the news is about, and you're not learning new practical information about actions to take. You kind of got down, you're supposed to wash your hands frequently, wear a mask, keep physically distanced. If you are going to interact with people, do it at a distance, outdoors. If you've already got that down, which I think most people have at least understood it, then you're probably not getting much more from watching the media. And so it's a good time to just disconnect, unplug, and connect with people, either in person if they're in your household, or remotely if you're not able to get together with them physically. And we should be advising children to also limit their amount of media exposure. So what I'm going to do now is I'm about halfway done. So what I'd like to do now is kind of transition to some basic advice on how to talk to and support children during the pandemic. So the first thing is, don't pretend that everything is okay when obviously it isn't. Children pick up when parents and other caregivers and important adults are not being genuine and honest, and they're going to be less likely to ask questions or seek advice when they sense that's the case. Children actually benefit from knowing that parents and other important adults in their lives, such as educators, are also having some troubling or distressing feelings, and have the same concerns or similar or different concerns. And most importantly, they need to learn out how those adults deal effectively with those difficult feelings. We can't expect children to share all of their concerns when we're unwilling to even admit we have concerns ourselves. And we can't help them learn how to cope with distress effectively if we never model effective coping strategies. But that doesn't mean that adults should share all of their concerns. Some concerns are primarily those of parents and other adults, such as how the pandemic may impact employment or income of parents and other extended family members. And parents should really try to address those concerns privately when children aren't likely to overhear the discussion. If children, though, do have financial concerns based on what they've overheard or what they've read in the newspaper, for example, then you can provide reassuring information to the extent it's honest that places the financial concerns in a context relevant to children. So for example, you could say, well, with everything that's going on, we've decided it's not a good time now to buy a new car. But please don't worry, we have enough money saved that we're able to meet our daily living expenses. Now, in some families, though, financial concerns were a significant issue prior to the pandemic and are only worse. So in your discussion with children, try to focus on what you honestly can provide rather than on what you may not be able to pay for if the situation worsens. What you really want to do is find out the individual child's fears, concerns, and skepticism. Children, as we know, often have very different fears and worries and concerns than adults do. But adults often have a wide range of concerns themselves. And you can't reassure people if you don't actually know what they're afraid of or concerned about. Otherwise, you probably aren't going to be able to offer reassurance, but rather you'll just be telling them why you aren't worried. And when two people each talk only from their own perspective, we call that arguing. And arguing is not a very effective way to provide reassurance. So you have to first find out, what is it that concerns you? Don't tell children that they shouldn't be worried or attempt to minimize their concerns. Instead, help them learn to deal with uncertainty and fear, and share with them strategies to deal with distressing feelings rather than pretend that they don't or shouldn't exist. You should try and be sure to include positive or reassuring information to the extent you honestly can, and present overall a hopeful perspective. Now, this is going to be hard to hear, but this is not actually a good time to convey to children a strong criticism of the government's response to date, or your personal candid assessment of the leadership of those in public office, unless kids are seeking your advice on how they should vote tomorrow in the election. And that's probably a small percent of the kids. Try instead to convey that you hope and expect that scientists and public health officials are learning how best to handle this situation, and you anticipate your community and the state and your country are going to be making the right decisions ultimately to address the pandemic effectively. As we have these discussions with children, I want to point out we should really be trying to avoid using fear-based approaches to encourage children to take preventative steps. People do need to feel a degree of risk in order to take preventive actions, but excess fear can actually be overwhelming and simply lead to more risky behavior. It can, for example, lead to a sense of fatalism. Kids and adults may conclude that this virus is everywhere, it spreads way too easily, and eventually you're just going to get it, so there's no reason to even take the steps to try and prevent the spread. They may also reach a conclusion that one or more risks have been exaggerated, making them conclude that perhaps all the risks are false or exaggerated as well. So if you say, if a kid comes back and says, well, I went to the grocery store and my mask fell off and I didn't get sick. And everybody talks about the fact that you have to wear a mask continuously, you're going to get it and you're going to die. And I didn't. And so I think this is all just exaggerated. And therefore, there's no reason to even wear a mask, or there's no reason to keep washing my hands. And there's no reason to stay away from my friends. So what we have to do is help them understand that risks are relative. They aren't absolute. And so there are reasonable steps we can take to decrease some of the risks. That may not make it zero, and they weren't 100% likely to cause us to get ill before, but they can make significant decreases in our relative risk, and it's worth the effort to do that. People may also become so afraid if we use fear too much that they may actually intentionally take a risk just to prove they can survive in spite of it. And this is probably one of the reasons why older kids experiment with risky behaviors. It's not because they believe themselves to be invulnerable, but it's that they believe themselves to be vulnerable and they just can't tolerate that. So they need to challenge those fears. I think this is one of the reasons why we are hearing, for example, of COVID parties among youth, where they get together, they intentionally expose themselves to someone who's infected, and they bet on who's going to get it first. It's not because they don't think anyone would catch it, because then why would they even do that? Why would you bet if no one's going to? I guess there's not really a way to win in that situation, but why would you even bet if you didn't think it was going to happen? And so sometimes they do the exact thing that they're terrified of, so they can reassure themselves that they actually were able to survive. So be thoughtful about trying to use fear. It sometimes looks like it's working on the short term, but it has problems in the long term. We should also be cautious about introducing other risks as a comparison in the context of the pandemic. Trying to reassure people by telling them that it could be worse and that more people have died recently of another reason, for example, car accidents, is actually just likely to make them think it's going to get worse rather than be reassuring, and it will make them afraid to get in a car. It doesn't reassure people. So what you really want to do instead is explore with children different strategies of dealing with distress, discomfort, anxiety, and sadness. And I've listed some on this slide. So that might include reading or hobbies to promote healthy distraction, but it could also be talking to others, journaling, blogging, art, and music, all to promote expression of feelings. We have to do both. Sometimes we have to face what's bothering us so that we can talk about it and process those feelings and fears and worries. And sometimes we have to step away and try and relax. The problem is people don't do it in sync. So you may have one person wanting to talk and the other person wanting to go out and jog, for example. And then the person who's left in the house while, let's say, a partner or spouse is jogging feels that that person is literally and figuratively running away from them and feel abandoned. So what you need to do is talk about that and say something like, well, I'm going to go out jogging right now. It seems like you want to talk. Would it be okay if we do that when I get back? Or let's talk first and then I'll go clear my head and go for a jog. So again, we don't want to make judgments that one or the other is wrong. It's just sometimes it doesn't work if you're not in sync. I've also listed some other things that can be used, like exercise and yoga, respectful humor that's used appropriately, and relaxation techniques and mindfulness, which actually can be taught to even very young children. What you really want to do is help kids identify developmentally appropriate steps they can take personally to both protect their health and to help others. We need to teach kids how to do self-care so they know the steps that they can take, because we can't expect when kids return to school in person for classroom educators to make sure that they never touch their face, that they always have the mask in the right position, that they continually stay 6 feet apart. Like, we can't, if we expect teachers to do that, we shouldn't expect them to teach, in which case there's no reason for the kids to be in school. So the kids are going to have to learn how to do this beforehand, and we should be practicing that now in preparation for when they will go back into public and be able to learn in classroom settings. And even in those situations, they will make mistakes. And we have to try not to get angry with them, but just say, oh, your mask is slipped. Could you please refix it? Why don't, I can show you how you would tie it. Let me demonstrate how you would keep the mask on so it doesn't slip as much, without getting very upset with them. But we can also, let kids figure out how they're going to do their own hand washing technique, even young children. Now, I've been saying this, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but to be quite honest, over half of the US population has had to celebrate their birthday separated from friends and loved ones. So probably the last song they want to sing every single time they wash their hands, multiple times a day, is Happy Birthday. So I think we need to let people figure out what's the best way for them to monitor to make sure they're doing the appropriate protective actions. But we can also identify ways that children can help others safely, such as dropping food off outside the door of elderly neighbors, or making regular phone calls to older relatives who would be otherwise socially isolated. If children can contribute to the response in a way that feels meaningful to them, they're less likely to feel helpless. And that will help them feel less powerless as well, and more able to cope with the distress. Now, we also have to realize that some children are going to need more assistance. The pandemic and discussion about the impact on families may remind children and adults of other difficulties or losses in their life. That could be events in the past, ongoing challenges, or even things they're afraid of in the future. And these children may find this time to be particularly difficult. Children who are in the midst of recovery from trauma or loss associated with the shooting at Saugus High School, for example, may find that the discussion of the pandemic and deaths associated with that just on television may cause a resurgence of some of the distressing feelings they felt around the time of the shooting. When I was talking with parents at Saugus High School, one parent referred to this as the double tragedy. And the issue is that one tragedy or crisis reminds you of others. And they aren't additive, they're actually more multiplicative. Children who were anxious or depressed before the pandemic, whether or not it was associated with the shooting, for example, will likely need even more support. So we should be encouraging families to reach out to mental health providers they had a relationship with in the past, by phone and email, to get advice and support. So if children were receiving counseling related to the tragedy at Saugus High School, but completed that counseling, this may actually be a good time to consider reconnecting. Now, we'll be talking about some of the resources available through the school system, so that's another option, is to reach out to some of those school professionals to be able to get some support. Now, we have to also recognize that when children are highly stressed, they may regress socially. They'll act less mature, become more demanding or selfish, or have more difficulty getting along with peers or family members. Some children may appear disinterested because they're actually overwhelmed with their own concerns. So you may find a teenager saying something like, this doesn't really bother me. I'm not worried about the pandemic. I'm just bored and I'm just upset I can't be with my friends and do what I want to do, but I'm not really worried about the pandemic. They may actually be worried about the pandemic. They may be so concerned about what's going on that they may need to focus first on their own needs. What does it mean for their college plans, their friendships, their sports, their hobbies? They may need to focus on all of that before they're able to start to think of the needs of others. And this is often a sign that they're under stress and having difficulty coping, not that they're just selfish. And we have to make sure we don't make them feel guilty for thinking about and sharing their distress about how this crisis impacts them personally, even if the impact is far less than it is on others. And you can imagine having a high school student be complaining about the fact that, for example, they can't play soccer and they think it's stupid and it's unfair. And, they'll make comments like, you don't even touch the ball with your hands. It's not, the virus isn't on your feet. It's not on the ball. We can stay 6 feet apart. This is stupid that we can't resume practices, or I can't go out and play in the park. Everyone's making a big deal out of this. And that it's people don't understand how isolating this is and how terrible it is, even though actually pretty much everyone in the world does understand, because it is a global pandemic and everyone is going through it. But you can imagine they'll talk about how it's impacting them. And finally, a parent or other adult will just say, you know what, you should be happy. So you can't play soccer. There are kids who don't have food. There are people who have had family members die. There are people who have lost their jobs and they're homeless, and you just can't go play soccer. So you really shouldn't be complaining about that. You should be thankful. Well, to be quite honest, if you're disappointed you can't play soccer, the fact that someone else had a death in their family doesn't make you feel better. It just makes you feel guilty when you're told that. And if kids feel guilty and self-conscious, they're just not going to talk about it anymore. But it's not actually going to make them feel better. And so you might ask, well, why would adults do that? Well, adults do it because they're stressed themselves. And they're also frustrated and don't know what to do in the midst of all of this. I hear a lot of people saying crisis brings out the best in people. I've done this work for over 30 years, and I will tell you, crisis tends to bring out people's distress. And we're all not going to be our best all the time. That includes all the professionals. And to be quite honest, being around people who are needy, demanding, self-centered, and distressed is really wears on you. Whether those are your colleagues, your friends, your family members, or just the public in general. So you need to be patient with your kids, with other adults in your life, and above all, you have to be patient with yourself. You're more likely to feel overwhelmed if you feel either unable or unprepared to provide meaningful and effective support to your kids. But there's actually a lot we can do, even in the midst of this pandemic, which is challenging. Just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we know nothing of value. You all know strategies that have worked in the past to decrease your children's distress, and you should try some of them now. You may not feel that what you can offer is enough all the time, and children may want and may even need more than you can provide at some times. And when that's the case, please contact your pediatrician or other pediatric healthcare provider by phone or email for advice. Reach out to resources in the school and school district and elsewhere in the community whenever you feel more is needed. But at least try and recognize and celebrate some of the positive contributions you do make. The moments you're able to get your kid to smile, if only for a moment, or help them learn something so they feel some sense of accomplishment during a time they would otherwise feel overwhelmed, or just help them solve a problem that's bothering them at that moment. Overall, we just have to try and set reasonable expectations. Children are just not going to learn as much schoolwork during this time period as they would have had we been able to keep schools open and if we weren't in a crisis. I've heard so many people talking about the fact how we just have to get the schools open so that we don't continue to have academic loss. Well, I've worked with a lot of schools after natural disasters and after violent events, and they do open schools often the next day or shortly thereafter, but the kids still have learning problems and the teachers still find it hard to teach. So I don't think it's just going to all go away when schools physically reopen. And I've been working with schools and communities that have physically reopened, and they're still having some struggles. So we don't want to try and keep the same pace of learning even when the schools are physically open, or children are just going to be overwhelmed and the educators will be overwhelmed too. And I'm just going to warn you now that when schools do resume and the virus is no longer a concern, we're not going to be able to catch up and learn everything that was missed during this time period. We have to recognize that at some level, the world has changed, and so too has the curriculum. If we are teaching children how to cope with distress and adjust to a crisis of this nature, we're actually helping them learn important life skills that are going to make them more resilient in the future and more capable of dealing with future challenges and adversity. And in the end, quite honestly, these are the lessons that really matter the most. We also have to recognize the way that children are learning during the pandemic. Let your children's teachers know what they're doing that is working and helpful for your children and for the parents as well during these challenging times. They're also unsure about what's really working, and it would be great if you could give them some positive feedback. Find some opportunities to do something enjoyable with your children. Let them share with you and show you what's important to them that maybe you didn't have time to share together before. And be sure to recognize again what you're doing that help your own children cope with the crisis. And at this point, I'm just going to give you a little bit of contact information and resources. So further information about the center and free resources can be found at schoolcrisiscenter.org. And if you look at the banner on the top that's kind of salmon colored, that will take you to the COVID-19 pandemic response resources webpage. And there you're going to find a guidance document on supporting grieving students during a pandemic, as well as presentations for educators, parents, and even students to support peers. And it goes over how do you talk to children and support them during the pandemic, and there are links to other resources as well. And this last slide provides contact information for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. Now, I do want to also mention that we have plans for the upcoming 1-year mark, or I should say the school system has plans, and you should have gotten some guidance documents about how to support children around the 1-year mark. And it can be very complicated. You know, I had one family from Saugus High School. They submitted some questions before I spoke with them. And some resented the continued focus on this one event, either because they didn't want their community defined by the tragedy, or they thought that emphasis on this tragedy may seem to minimize other tragedies impacting children and adults in their communities. Whereas another family said that the child just wants to forget about the shooting and take a break. So some people are worried there's too much focus. Some people are worried there's not enough focus. And there was a comment from another family that it feels like people have just stopped paying attention to the ongoing impact of the shooting. So there are a range of issues about how you do respond to a shooting and what you do at the 1-year mark. So what I thought I would do is, instead of trying to go over that material, which was sent in writing, I'll just answer questions people might have. And I wanted to make sure that I gave at least an hour to just questions and discussion. So at this point, maybe what I'll do is break here and just see if people have some questions that they can share. And I think we can either do that in the, do you want to use, have people been entering it into the chat box?
You're welcome to put things into the chat box, or if people would like to unmute and ask the question, they can do it that way. I think either way would be fine. It's a small enough group. I haven't seen anything in the chat thus far.
I just want to make sure people did get copies of the guidance material on how to support kids around the 1-year mark. We, by the way, we avoid the use of the word anniversary because victims' families tell us that anniversaries are associated with celebrations, and so they don't like to use the word anniversary. They also tell us they don't like to use the word event because for this, I'm not as sure, but I think they tend to feel that events are positive events, although we do, you know, we talk about tragic events. So for some families, they tell us that they don't like the word event and they don't like the word anniversary. So that's why the documents get very wordy, because we're trying to avoid certain words that can be sensitizing to people.
Perfect. Those did get sent out, and then a Blackboard is scheduled to send after the meeting that includes those as well, as another follow-up. Sue, I noticed you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
I wasn't quite sure if it was more appropriate when we meet as a staff. I was going to ask about a particular situation in terms of one of the victims.
That might be something maybe we can connect you directly to Dr. Schonfeld or Dr.
Yeah,
Beatty.
unless it's a general issue. If you're talking about an individual's response, then we probably should talk about that at another time.
No, it's not an individual's response. It's the response. We have a sibling, and that I'll leave it at that.
I think that probably is a good conversation to have with maybe just Dr. Beatty or Dr. Schoenfeld. They've both been involved in the planning.
Right, right.
But I think it's a general point, though, that some individuals have connections which may place them most at risk to have difficulty adjusting. Now, that could be because they had more exposure. So, for example, they were close to an individual who was shot or killed at that time, so that they have more proximity physically, but it can also be emotional proximity or affiliation. So it may be that it's a relative, that it's a friend. It can be a friend of the individual an individual that died, or it can be a friend of the individual who did the shooting. So I understand that there were some people who were friends or relatives of the shooter. There have been a couple situations that I've been involved with where the shooter was actually quite popular and well respected. In those situations, they generally killed themselves, and so some people felt it was more of a kind of a related to suicide in that situation. But that can make it very difficult to cope with and adjust. Or it may be that somebody had another death from an unrelated cause, and so discussion of grief can also be more difficult. We find, for example, that we actually have guidance documents on how to support kids who are grieving around Day of the Dead and Halloween. But we also have one for Thanksgiving and the winter holidays. So those are difficult times when you've lost a family member or friend, when you see a lot of things on TV about joy and being close and being near the people that you love, you can acutely miss that person. I mean, as a very mundane example, when one of my daughters was young, her bunny rabbit got sick, her pet rabbit, and actually went from just wondering if everything was okay to actually having to euthanize the bunny within a couple hours on a Friday night. Unfortunately, it was Good Friday. And I just remember her looking at me on Monday saying, "You have no idea how many images of rabbits you see on television during Easter weekend." So it's just this constant reminder that her rabbit was suddenly dead, and that she had to make decisions about whether she was going to put the rabbit down, and was it going to be buried, was it going to be cremated, and then she's seeing bunnies all over the place. And so, we get these reminders, and that's part of what we work with staff and to try and help kids deal with that. But it can be almost anything, to be quite honest. So yes, there are some people who are more likely to be impacted, whether it's from something specific to the actual tragedy, or whether it's something else that's in their lives. So individuals who have racial inequality or have financial problems, they may also be disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, not just for the way that people have described, that is that individuals who are socially disadvantaged and financially disadvantaged tend to be sicker and have less access to healthcare, and as a result are more likely to become physically ill as a result of infection. But they also tend to be in essential jobs and can't hire people to deliver their food in physically distanced ways. So all of these things are interrelated. And it just, people who are disadvantaged for one reason tend to be multiply disadvantaged. And I saw here, can you give some advice on how to support a student that's coping quite well, but living with a high school sibling who's experiencing severe depression? So yes, if someone you care about is struggling, you may be struggling as well. That of course happens to parents all the time when their kids are struggling, but it can be because of friends, and friends will support each other. And sometimes that's a burden. If somebody's really worried about their friend being very, very depressed and feel that they have to somehow try and cheer them up or help them, So in those situations, if the kids know they're getting help from someone else, such as their parent or another adult or a school mental health provider, that may make the friend, the kid, feel less burdened and more that they're able to, trust that they're getting the assistance that they need. This happens all the time. I remember one of my kids was home for a holiday break in the winter, and she was in college. And she just came up to me one day and she said, Dad, I really could use some advice. I'm in the sorority. One of the girls in the sorority broke up with her boyfriend, and her boyfriend has just posted on her wall on Facebook that she's suicidal. And he can't help her because she won't talk to him anymore. And he's really worried. What do I do? So I'm like, well, is this someone you're close with? And she goes, I've met her once or twice. I don't know how to contact her. She's not a friend of mine. And so I'm like, okay, well, how do you make sure she gets help? And so, we discussed that. And I explained to her that sororities and most school activities have advisors. And I said, do you know who the advisor is for your sorority? Who's related to this, who works at the school, at the college? Do you know how to reach him or her? And she said, yes, I can do that. And within an hour or two, she was actually able to reach out to that person. That person reached out to the family, contacted my daughter to say, the girl is in counseling. They are aware of the concerns. It has been communicated. We've got it covered. Now, this was like, December 26th or something, and she's just worried about someone she doesn't even know that well. But because we were able to reassure her, just with some problem solving as parent, this is how you can get this taken care of. It really only took a matter of a couple hours, but you could imagine that would otherwise be something that would worry her throughout the holiday break. And I remember when she was in elementary school, I came home one day and my wife just looked at me and she said, why don't you ask your daughter what she did at lunch today? And I was like, what did you do? And she said, I went to Banana Splits. And I'm like, what's Banana Splits? And she goes, it's a group for children whose parents are divorced or separated. And I was like, are you worried about something? Or do you know something that I don't know? And she was like, no, Dad, I'm not worried about you and Mom. And I said, okay, then why are you going? And she looks at me and she goes, well, I have a good friend, one of my friends, her parents are separated and getting divorced. And she really needs to talk to someone. And I don't think she'll go unless I go with her. And then she looks at me and she goes, and they serve brownies. And I'm like, well, dear, you can't go for the brownies. She really does like desserts. And so she was like, I know, Dad, but I really need to go with her. And I'm like, okay. So I look at my wife and I go, is there a problem here? And she looks at me and she goes, ask her how long she's been going. And I'm like, how long have you been doing this? She goes, 3 months. And I go, you've been going 3 months for the brownies? And she's like, no, they are really good, but no, I think she still needs the help. And I know if I stop going, she won't go without me. So I don't think we can underestimate how much kids really do to take care of other kids. And I mean, we didn't even know it. It was going on for months. And I guess as my kids have gotten older, they're adults now. They've shared with me some of the things that they have done for their friends, including some things that are really very serious. Helping. One of my kids was trying to figure out how to support a friend who was sexually assaulted by one of the staff at the school. Now that did become known and the teacher was removed and it was in the press, but she's like, how do I help her through this? I mean, I do talk to her about it. Do I ask her? My kids have helped people around substance use, some very serious things. And we tend to be naive and think that, children's lives are joyful. They weren't prior to the pandemic entirely joyful. There were stressors they were dealing with then. It's just got a lot more now. And so, yes, I think what you try and do is make sure that the kid knows that the other person is getting help and that they are not responsible for making sure that they're safe. But you also want to make sure that they tell you if you ever think that person is at risk of hurting themselves, you can't keep that a secret. You have to tell me about that. Friends don't allow their friends to hurt themselves, and your friend will understand, or at least your friend, will be safe And that's what's most important. So what you want to do is try and give them some sense of what can you say, what can you do, what might be helpful without being burdensome. And I don't know if any of the school mental health providers want to add to any of that, but those are some of the things I would suggest. I don't know if there are any other, and really please feel free to ask other questions.
Mr. Schonfeld, this is Tony Williams. I had a quick little question for you. So my daughter actually went through a very traumatic experience because she was actually at Saga School when it happened. And so she was actually literally in class, and it actually happened right outside her classroom. So she was really kind of hit by it. The question I guess I would ask is, so with my son, he saw the effects obviously on her. And we did a lot of in-depth talking about it, how did it make you feel, not even just with her, but with him, understanding the scope of what happened went on. Now with everybody away from school, but eventually when we do come back, what are your thoughts on the preemptive mode of explaining to the students, especially from a junior high standpoint, of what this really means? It's such a touchy subject because some parents don't like to talk about it. It's more of, don't talk about it, push it out, that type of thing. And I know from my standpoint, I was always kind of ahead of the curve to say, let's explain what this really means. How does this make you feel? Those type of things. Do you recommend a pre-strike just talking about in terms of like what it really meant? Or is this more of just kind of like walk that fine line of not diving too much into it, upsetting parents type of thing?
Well, that's a great question. So first off, you never want to talk about it too much, and it is possible to talk about it too much, but it's much more likely that you talk about it too little.
Right.
When the 1 year mark comes, there's usually some media coverage, or there's at least discussion. And so as a result, people often remember what they felt like at the time, and they get a resurgence temporarily of those feelings. So not talking about it actually just suggests that you don't think kids can handle it, or that you're not willing or able to help them. So what you really want to do is bring up, something. And, so it might be a simple conversation like, oh, I know that it's almost 1 year since the shooting happened at Saugus High School, which of course the kids know that. I have actually found this I've done this work for over 30 years, and we call these anniversary reactions, even though we don't like to use the term anniversary with families. But I think anniversary reactions are happening a lot more now. And personally, I think it started on the World Trade Center attack because everyone called it 9/11. And so everyone remembers the date. So once we started calling these events by the date, the attack that occurred in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was on Valentine's Day, but they often call it 2/14. So for some reason, we just started using dates, and now everyone remembers the dates. I have trouble remembering my family members' birthdays, but I don't have trouble remembering the dates of these tragedies because they call them that. So I think it would be very naive to think that kids who are aware of what day it is, I mean, like a 2 or 3 year old won't, but everyone else is probably going to recall that it happened at about that time. And there also are situational reminders, what's in the news. I remember talking to one of the Amish families in Pennsylvania after the Amish schoolhouse shooting there. And they just said, what reminds me? It's the fall nights, right when the corn is about ready to be picked and it's mature and it brushes against the other corn stalks in the wind. That noise, that reminds me of that day. It wouldn't remind me of that day, but they're they're very connected with nature and with farming. And so people make associations and they will recall. And so I think it is a good idea to just say to kids, they're going to be doing something on that weekend or around that time in your school. They have extra wellness sessions. I just wanted to check with you. How are you doing? How are you feeling about this? And let you know you can talk to me about it at any point. It's not like you have to sit down and go over it in a lot of detail. You can just say, I just went to a presentation at the school, and we had someone come and talk about how to help your kids. And so I just thought it would be a good idea for me to ask, what can I do to help you? I think you can just be open and candid, but you don't necessarily have to talk about it constantly. That would be too much, I think. But certainly acknowledging that, you may be reminded of this, and sometimes a year afterwards, we think about what we felt like that day, and it can make us feel bad for a while. And I want you to know I'm here to help you with that, and so is the rest of the school.
Thank you for the answer.
Sure.
I guess if I would follow up on one thing is, would you recommend that when kids do return, that it's kind of, I don't want to say that it's dealt with, but more of kind of acknowledged, like I'm just throwing this off the top of my head. People come back and they say, hey, the PAC team say, we want to throw a donation to remember the victims, type of thing. Is that kind of like reopening the wound, or is that kind of like taking a bad situation and allowing people to digest it and being able to help with the long-term healing?
Sure. Commemoration and memorialization activities are actually helpful to help people cope with what they've lost or what was altered or changed by these tragedies. We don't want to relive the nature of the tragedy. In other words, we don't want, so, the example that I often give is, I don't think it's useful to have a moment of silence at exactly the time the gunshot occurred. I did a lot of work with New York City after 9/11, and on the 1-year mark, they had planes fly in formation to the site where each tower was at exactly the moment when they were hit 1 year prior. And when I heard about that, that was obviously not the school's decision. And some of this is planes flying in formation after pilots are killed is part of the tradition. It's like a 21 gun salute in the military, but for people who have experienced combat losses, they don't really want to hear guns go off at around that time. But there's part of the culture and the tradition. But I was concerned because I was like, kids are going to be right back in their classrooms. Some of those classrooms had views of the World Trade Center. Planes are going to be flying right at that point. It's just a reminder. It's just a traumatic reminder. So Anne Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, when they decided what they were going to do, they wanted to have a moment of silence. But they actually only had school in the morning that day so that families could be home with loved ones. The shooting happened in the afternoon. So we made it a half day of school so the kids could come in and use the wellness center and get counseling and support, and they could be together and acknowledge what had happened. And then they had more activities in the park and other things to bring the community together. But what they decided to do was to have a moment of silence throughout the entire district. And they did it at 10:14. They did it in the middle of the morning because that's when the kids were there. And then the minutes were based on the number of victims. It wasn't based on the time that the shooting occurred. So the idea was, let's figure out how we can honor and acknowledge what was lost, but not recreate the experience. So we've had those discussions within the school system. And so they are planning commemorative and memorial activities. They were going to be in person, but now they're virtual, which means actually that kids from the middle school and elementary school can participate now as well. It can also be taped so that you don't have to view it while it's occurring if you might think that would be upsetting, or if the parents want to watch it first and then decide if they're going to share it with their kids. Or, although I would think most of it would be quite appropriate to share with kids because that's why it's being done, so that it is helpful to them. So yes, I do think commemoration and memorialization is helpful. I think repeating the trauma is not. So, I've had situations, I was on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, and one of the parents came to testify in the spring, and she said she got the yearbook from Sandy Hook because one of her kids was attending Sandy Hook, and she said she opened it up and the picture of her child that was killed there was removed, as were all the pictures of all of the victims. And she said it's as if they never existed. And she just looked at us and said, well, what were they thinking? So I think the thing is, you don't want to relive the traumatic experience, but you don't want to forget the people who died. So you do want to do commemoration memorialization. It would be like saying don't have a funeral. It's just going to upset them. No, they're upset because the person died. And people actually derive comfort from some of the ceremony and from the coming together. Even though we can't do that physically, we can come together remotely. And so we can practice some of those same commemoration memorialization, doing it remotely. I mean, I've now gone through, when I say gone through, I've attended a virtual wedding and a virtual funeral and virtual sitting Shiva. I mean, we can figure out how to do this remotely. It's not as good, but it approximates some of the value, some of the social function that we can obtain from it. So I do think kids, you know, when they come together to talk about what's happened, it gives them an ability to not only express as a group and to understand that others have similar types of feelings, but it's also a time where people can share their coping techniques. And so it is helpful for kids to commemorate and memorialize.
Thank you very much. I definitely agree. I feel like if they feel like they are contributing towards the healing process, it not only helps them digest into what's going on, but makes them involved with turning a tragedy into something that they're participating in helping. So, but thank you very much for the answer.
Sure. And the challenge is you either talk to someone or knew intuitively what to do, and many parents that are grounded in best parenting practices figure it out and know what to do. Some parents don't. I mean, sometimes they're tentative, they're concerned, they're worried that they're going to upset their kids, they don't feel prepared to do it. And I just think that in the midst of the pandemic, people are just so worried about so many things that they might just say, I just don't think I can handle one more thing. I don't want my kid to have to deal with it. And they may not even follow the practices that they would have followed outside the pandemic. You know, the analogy that gets used all the time, this just came up last week. I was on a panel and president of the organization used the example and said, you know, it's like when you're in the plane and the oxygen masks descend, you're supposed to put them on yourself, the adults, before you put them on children. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. But if you really look at the directions in the, you know, in the seat pocket where they say take out those directions, I used to fly every week. So I would sometimes get bored and just actually look through the seat pocket. And I would say about half the time now, they've added a clock onto the directions. And it shows that you put your mask on yourself as the adult first, and within 2 or 3 seconds, you put it on the child. I mean, the bottom line is if you need oxygen on a plane, you put it on the adult first so they don't pass out before they help the child. But you can't wait and just say, I'm not comfortable yet. You know, like I'm going to wait till I feel okay and relaxed and take a couple deep breaths. You can't do that. I mean, we have to start getting to the kids. And what I'm finding is that people are just so overwhelmed. I talked to a couple professional organizations and they're like, can you come talk to our members? And I go, okay, this was like in March or April. And they said, we're thinking in September. I'm like, you're thinking in September? That's like in 4 or 5 months. And they're like, yeah, well, that's when we think the kids will be coming back to school. I said, well, what do you expect them to do for 6 months? Just deal with this themselves? Like, it would baffle me. I would be like, we have to start helping them now. I mean, it's hard. I don't know exactly what to do either, but we have to approximate what we think will work. But although, Tony, maybe you do that, and I'm sure you do, but there's some parents who just don't feel comfortable doing that. They're just so overwhelmed or uncomfortable, or they just are afraid they're going to, you know, upset their kid or damage them in some way, that they just don't have that conversation. That's a real shame. It's a shame for the parent and it's a shame for the kid, but it's understandable. So that's why we put together, you know, the guidance documents about how to do it. And the school is taking, you know, some steps to try and help with commemoration memorialization as well, because they know it's difficult.
Yeah, going through with my own daughter, just to share this with the whole team, is that it was, it's almost a double-edged sword, because when obviously being at home during this time, being away from the environment was kind of helpful for her. But at the same token, I've noticed that the external factors, like somebody was yelling outside her window, it invoked a feeling that she didn't like, or someone dropped a bottle or something that sounded like something shattering. It's these little triggers that kept on going. Because even as a parent, we don't know how to deal with this. This is like something that we've never even gone through, let alone walk someone through it. And so what I've noticed with her is that obviously we got therapy for her, and then obviously it was just constant, almost retraining of her mind to say that she's safe, she is safe, she is safe, type of a thing. And it's just a lot of talking that really kind of got through. And even then, that took months upon months to kind of retrain herself right there. So, and then acknowledging it, and then honoring the victims from it, that type of stuff. And that was kind of like the steps. And the thing is that the only way I honestly saw that she truly got through it was honestly just talking about it and reassuring, and just constantly rinse and repeat, so that she can literally retrain herself that she is growing from this. So that was just my experience with it. And I want to make sure that we address it with the kids. And I know it's so hard to walk a fine line because you don't want to offend parents with their comfort zone, that type of thing. It's just that then when she started feeling better, then she invested energy into Dominic and all the victims that were involved, because she knew them. And I think honestly that was such a big help to her to kind of like take this tragedy and put effort into making it better.
Yeah, and what you're describing, the retraining, is what you have to do. That's what cognitive behavioral therapy is. It is changing the way you think about crisis events that cause trauma. And if you think about it, when you have a really traumatic event, we call it N of one learning. The example they always use, if you were cavemen and someone was attacked by a tiger, you learn it very quickly. And you don't need another example. If you survive it, or you survive witnessing it, you learn it. And it's just automatically hardwired, because it's not the type of thing that you want to ever not get right the next time. So what you have to do is unlearn that association, because what happens is you are feeling in danger because of something that reminds you of it, and it happens, it's hardwired, so that you have to relearn that no, loud noises don't always mean gunshots. People shouting don't always mean that they're in crisis. And that's what cognitive behavioral therapy, that's what it's about, is changing how you think about things so that it changes your feelings and ultimately your behaviors. So what you're describing is what you would expect from people who go through very traumatic events. You would actually be worried if they didn't automatically react to certain things, because that is an adaptive response to a life-threatening experience that's catastrophic. So it's a certain amount where you just have to kind of tell the person, yes, what you're going, this is where I always have problems about, do we call it abnormal? Because if we call it normal, then they don't get help. If we call it abnormal, they think there's something wrong with them. And there is something bothering them. But individuals who go through those type of experience have typical reactions, and those typical reactions may still cause problems. And then you have to help them respond more adaptively.
Great answer. Thank you very much.
Other questions that people have, or comments that they want to make? Well, I will leave it up to you, Andy, if you feel there's something else you want to cover in the meeting, or when you feel there's a natural breaking point. I'll turn that back to you.
Thank you. Mrs. McCoo, did you want to share a little bit about some of the supports that are available here at the school?
Absolutely. So just in case you logged in late and didn't see it in the chat, I'm going to reshare. There's a Google form for you. If you are in need of support, want us to reach out to you, you can use that. And we'll make sure we link you with the right person. I'm also going to share my screen really quickly. So this will go out in an email at 6 o'clock tonight as well. So you don't have to memorize everything that's there, but just to give you an idea, there are some district resources that are available, such as the Heart District Wellness site, the Heart District Wellness Warm Line. We've just started a kindness wall. So that can be found on our website, just a nice way of kind of lifting people up. We have our virtual break room. So our break room is our wellness center. The kids named it. They wanted it to sound like some place that you go to take a break. And that's what they came up with. I thought it was kind of cool. We opened it right about a month before we closed down. So eventually we'll get it back open for kids, but right now it is available virtually. There's a Google Classroom code. Our counseling team, I cannot tell you how hard these people work for our kids. So many of your children are already reaching out to them on their own via email. One of the things that they're doing is they have an open Zoom for students. Sorry, parents, you don't get to attend this one, but they do have an open Zoom available for parents every Thursday from 1:15 to 2:15. That link is in their Google Classrooms that they've set up for kids. But I've also provided it here so you can encourage your child to pop in there if they want to talk to them. They have a waiting room, so it's one kid at a time, but it's open so the kids don't need to make an appointment. A couple other things that are on this are just some community resources that we partner often with Child Family Center and the Children's Bureau to help our kids. So I think that's kind of valuable for everybody to see. Some other things you might see us sending information out. We do have a parent group that we provide every about 2 to 3 weeks, where we bring in some of our district therapists or some local mental health providers that will help us talk about how are our kids experiencing the pandemic and what are some ways to support them. We often have a pediatrician available as well to kind of give that perspective, and usually some kind of wellness expert. So somebody that is going to talk to us about just some different ways to help your kids cope and some different things that are available to them during the pandemic, even though we kind of sometimes think there just isn't a lot for them to do. And I feel like there was one other thing. You also may have noticed we've been checking in with our kids weekly using an app called Close Gap. We reach out to the kiddos that seem like maybe they're not doing so great that day, just to make sure that they know that we're there. So there's a lot going on, and we're always open to suggestions if you think there's other needs out there. And you can find any of our email addresses on the website. And if we're not the right person, we'll get you in touch with the right person.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think that's all we've got, unless there are additional questions. I do want to, again, thank you so much, Dr. Schonfeld, for coming out and presenting and fielding our questions. And I know it was very enlightening and very helpful. So definitely we appreciate it. Thank you.